I think it's all about building relationships, whether you call it stewardship or a volunteer journey or whatever. It's all about building that relationship with the person who's going to give time or give money. So I think there are a lot of synergies between the two. And I do think as people are connected to the cause, they become more so if they are involved in other activities. So yes, I think that people who give money to an organisation are more interested in giving time, and vice versa. If you are giving time in a small way to an organisation, you build that relationship, and eventually you become somebody who also wants to be committed by giving money. And I do think there's a nice synergy that runs along the two.
That was Ruth Leonard, Chair of the Association of Volunteer Managers and Head of Volunteering Development at Macmillan Cancer Support. The AVM is an independent membership body that aims to support and represent people in volunteer management, and Macmillan Cancer Support is one of the UK's most recognised charities. On today's episode, Ruth discusses how important it is to build relationships with volunteers with the goal of turning them into donors. The secret to Ruth's success is to find inspiration in those around her. Not necessarily in volunteering, a good idea can come from anywhere. I want to welcome you, Ruth Leonard, to the Engaged Volunteer podcast. Thank you so much, Ruth, for coming to see us.
Thank you, Martin, for inviting me.
We've been really excited about having you come over. We know that Macmillan is a very well-known and respected and adored charity in the UK, and you have a unique perspective of Macmillan because you've been there for
11 years.
11 years. That's a long time in one charity, and well done, first of all, for supporting that charity for that amount of time. You must have really put your heart and soul into that too, so it must mean a lot to you personally.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to work in the charity sector, and the reason that Macmillan particularly drew me was because about 6 months before the job came up, my father died of cancer. He died of mesothelioma, and actually, as we are being recorded within Bermondsey, this is one of the things that really attracted me, because at the point when he was brought up in Bermondsey, there were asbestos factories all around us. And as a child, he played in the asbestos, as lots of people did, because it's like snow if you jump in it. And then 50 odd years later, he was diagnosed with mesothelioma. So that really opened my eyes to cancer and what it was like, and the experience that he and my mother had as they went through that diagnosis and in his case, his end of life. And that was really made me feel I want to be working in that field, involving volunteers, which is what I'd always done.
Thank you for sharing that, by the way. It's very kind of you to share that. And an interesting anecdote with it geographically being so, in this area too. I was going to ask if you think that's quite common, that people have that life experience and that's the thing that puts them into the career path for people. So did you pick out Macmillan specifically, or is it like that's in your heart, so you're naturally going to be drawn that way?
I think lots of people who choose to work in particular charities are drawn to the cause. And then they stay for the job and the role. Before Macmillan, I was at Samaritans, and similarly, I was really drawn to the cause of helping people through their emotional health and being that kind of element in it. So yes, I do think that, and I think particularly within the volunteering role, we know that people give their time for something that's important to them, and that's what keeps them going. So having that interlink between my personal passion for the cause and my real excitement about involving people who've got that want to give it. But yeah, lots of people have stories and connections to the cause of the organisation that they're working for.
Do you think that explains the longevity? Because I know seems to be a common theme of leadership roles within charities, is that a decade seems to be the minimum that they stay in these. You very much are connected to the cause, which makes it probably quite difficult to move away. Like, I'm not suggesting that you've given any indication that you'd want to leave Macmillan, but what I notice, some of the conversations that I've had with people in leadership roles in charities, is that there's almost a guilt as well that I've developed skill sets, I've helped progress. I couldn't possibly move these skills onto somewhere else because I owe it to myself to stay here for a while.
That's interesting. I think my greatest driver for a career is to be able to help people fight for their own corner. So in some senses, yes, it's true that I've got a personal passion for Macmillan, but the most driving element for me is to help people to get to what's important for them. So,
Nice.
for example, before Samaritans, I worked at the Cleft Lip and Palate Association.
Yeah.
I have no personal experience of cleft lip and palate, but being able to create the environment for individuals to really express their needs and fight for what they wanted was probably the most important. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited by involving volunteers, because it's trying to put a space in that gap that can help people who are just about holding on, not necessarily yet needing really crucial and vital services, but are managing. And that's where volunteering can fit into that, by being there to enable you to have the conversation about what's important in your head, rather than, for example, at Macmillan, the clinical element. You can talk to me about what it's like in that kind of situation, and that's power.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's take a step back and let's talk about your role. What is your role at Macmillan?
I'm the head of volunteering development and operations at Macmillan, and that means I enable the people who are managing volunteers directly either to provide services to people living with cancer or to do some of the amazing fundraising that we are doing, and also to lead the team that provides the best practice on volunteer management. A lot of our volunteers are actually being managed externally from Macmillan. So, for example, in hospital, so at Guy's Hospital up the road, the Information and Support Centre will involve volunteers, and those are managed by the NHS, and my team support the NHS staff to be able to manage volunteers in the way that meets Macmillan's needs.
Does that present any sort of unique challenges with it being them managing effectively your support team? Really?
Yeah, I think there's unique challenges from the perspective of the relationships with the line managers in another organisation, the matrix management element. But the other really interesting place of volunteers themselves and where they feel connected, because I mentioned earlier around being connected to causes. You may very well have a passion for volunteering for Macmillan, but equally you might be a volunteer who really wants to do the best you can for Guy's Hospital. And how do we make sure that you, as somebody who's giving your time, can feel the benefit for both of those and not have to feel identified by any particular organisation, because it's cause rather than organisation that drives people into doing it.
How do you approach that? And what's the big question?
So I have recently written a book, co-authored a book on volunteer involvement, and one of the key areas of that is about involving volunteers is developing relationships. It's looking at how do we connect, how do we collaborate, and how does the volunteer and the staff member or the people involving volunteers complement each other. So the simple answer is I manage that by building that relationship and having the understanding about what, for example, you, Martin, might want to do with your time that you are so kindly giving us, and how can we best support you within that, and have the conversation around, well, this is the activity that we really want to doing, but how can you use your skills to stretch that or change that or be offered in a different way. So from a Macmillan perspective, we'll have that conversation with the other organisations that are involving volunteers on our behalf to see whether we can be flexible.
I was just about to ask you, how on earth do you do that at scale? Because how many volunteers do you think that you have?
So directly within Macmillan, probably about 15,000. Am I right? I'll check.
Probably check. That's a lot of people, though, to understand what their motives are and what drives them. I mean, do you have to go to like the individual managers of those locations and ask them to almost survey their own people, or like how does that work for you?
That's part of the volunteer management pathway, to be able to make sure that when you bring somebody on, you're really clear about the role that is needed to be carried out, and then have that conversation. So it wouldn't necessarily be me or even my team directly, it would be the person who's managing them on the ground. So my team provides that training to the people managing on the ground to be able to hold those conversations.
Well, why put that effort in? Like, you already generate a lot of fundraising. There'll always be people that will want to support your cause. What's the drive behind going that extra mile and finding out what motivates them?
Because that's when we can get the best out of people. So enabling volunteering is about making sure that people are equipped with the right skills that they can make the difference in their community. So it's going to be a better experience for the volunteers, but also a better outcome for an organisation if we could really learn, hear from and build on what you think some of the needs might be rather than a top-down approach. And involving volunteers, it's a really good question about, you've got lots of money, so why would you? One of the things I like to ask people when we're thinking about volunteering is, if you had all the money you could ever want, would you involve volunteers? And the answer would be yes, because of what volunteers bring, which is about being able to add relevance to the conversation, being an equal participant and really be quizzical. And we could see that the opportunity of speaking to somebody who's there because they want to be there for you, rather than you're on my rounds, if you like, and I'm coming to talk to you because I'm being paid to do so. And I know that's not quite the situation it is, and everybody has a lot of empathy and emotions, but being there with a volunteer who can give you that opportunity to talk about things that feel to the individual as though they are less important. So one example I had when I was at Cleft Lip and Palate Association is answering a call to a mother who was really distressed because her child was going through a lot of bibs.
Right.
She didn't feel that that question was something relevant to ask on the clinical nurses because she didn't want to waste their time. But being able to speak to somebody who was giving their time was a place that she could really just say, this is what is important to me. So there's that added value of speaking to somebody who can just be there for you.
Yeah, the funds can pay for the care and the medical support, but they can't get to the kind of heart of the issue and the connection between the volunteer and the people that need help, right? I guess it enables it to a degree.
It enables it,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah, because certainly we don't want to say that people who are being paid don't have that heart and connection.
Yeah.
But it does enable that deeper conversation that's more personal.
Do you find that a more engaged volunteer is perhaps more likely to offer both funds and volunteering as well? It's just something that we've been thinking about Rostify a bit, is the connection between engaged volunteers and fundraising, and not thinking them as being two separate siloed things, where in actual fact, I mean, you'll have to forgive me, but I feel like a lot of charities are actually almost built siloed like that, where you'll have a head of fundraising and a head of volunteering. Well, there's a massive connection there between those two things, because one can lead to the other too. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's all about building relationships, whether you call it stewardship or a volunteer journey or whatever. It's all about building that relationship with a person who's going to give time or give money. So I think there are a lot of synergies between the two. And I do think as people are connected to the cause, they become more so if they are involved in other activities. So yes, I think that people who give money to an organisation are more interested in giving time, and vice versa. If you are giving time in a small way to an organisation, you build that relationship, and eventually you become somebody who also wants to be committed by giving money. And I do think there's a nice synergy that runs along the two.
Yeah, you said that you've been there for 11 years, which is brilliant. At Macmillan for 11 years. Sorry if this is a bit of a big question, but I'm wondering how you feel that volunteering at Macmillan has changed during those 10 years. And obviously you can't get over the elephant in the room that is like COVID, and the way that changed things as well. But speaking more broadly about helping people and supporting each other, have you seen much of a change there, or has it been kind of like these things have happened in the background, but to the heart of it, the volunteer journey and experience has always been kind of similar?
One of the big things that we had to do during COVID was to completely remodel some of our volunteering offers, particularly with regard to service volunteering, but also to our fundraisers who are out there on the streets. And both sets of volunteer roles had to change almost overnight, and it was really painful to volunteers who really wanted to be there and connected. So what we did for the service volunteering is change it from a face-to-face, in your home, in your community type of offer to being by phone, on the phone. What that gave us, and what that was really an amazing experience for all of the organisation to work through, was an opportunity to reach people more widely. So if you were being supported in a face-to-face capacity, you're really dependent on which volunteers are geographically near you. If you're on the phone, you could be speaking from London to somebody in Glasgow, and you could be able to move like that. So in some senses, that really gave us more flexibility to be able to bring volunteers in and give them a different opportunity, and probably more importantly, because we shouldn't have volunteering just for the sake of volunteering. It should be there to meet the needs of the people that the organisation is serving. Even more importantly, we reached a different demographic of people who are being able to access those services. Returning to face-to-face, as we have tried to, has been slower than we'd expected. There was sadness from our volunteers that they weren't able to reach the people that they were previously supporting in the ways that they previously supported. So we had expected when we could say, it's okay if you come back to face-to-face, that we would have people coming in, but there was a drop-off.
Okay.
And people haven't returned in the same way to that.
Yeah, I think that's been quite common, actually. We have an interesting, I guess, perspective at Rostify because we service charities, non-profits, but then also the sporting sector as well. And it is interesting when I hear the challenges that, say, an event, a mass sporting event might have, aren't necessarily about recruitment. And that's mostly because an event turns up and everybody just wants to be a part of it just for that one instance. And that's great. But it's more important for charities, and particularly in like the charity retail space or personal services, to not just want to volunteer, but actually make a commitment to sticking to that and being there reliably week in, week out. And we have seen that recruitment is still very much a challenge post-COVID. What are you guys doing to sort of address that? Like, what's the bigger issue there?
We're looking very much at opportunities that are flexible in your time, in your place, sometimes referred to as micro volunteers, so a smaller opportunity that people can get engaged in a way that is easier and less of a time commitment. So that's one of the things that I was interested in exploring anyway before it became a real need to do that. That's what we're consciously trying to see. How can we really add relevant opportunity that makes a difference to a potential volunteer and is really of value to the organisation, and how can we marry the two up?
And the demographic of people that volunteer at Macmillan, do you know roughly what that looks like? I imagine it's probably quite broad actually, but there's got to be certain trends of people that do that. And are you seeing any signs of that changing? And is that changing your strategy when it comes to recruitment, or are you using a bit more of a one-size-fits-all to encouraging help and assistance? Or?
Yeah, one of the real values of involving volunteers is that they add that reach into communities that we're not necessarily reaching alternatively. So that's a real driver for us, that whole element of having an inclusive opportunities that are available for people. Our general demographic has been people like me, so women in their 50s who come from a certain middle class background is probably our greatest demographic, but we are seeing changes of people coming through. And one of the things that we saw during our telephone buddy offer was the opportunity to reach people whose languages were not English first and foremost, who were coming from a younger age group. We had more male volunteers than we did originally. So we are really trying to target audiences. One of the things that Macmillan is doing, and I've been involved in supporting from that volunteer management perspective, is consciously reaching out to community groups that are representing different communities than we may have reached so easily. Yeah. So we're really trying to make sure that we can enable the conditions.
Yeah, I mean, diversity and representation is really important, and doesn't matter what charity is, or cancer doesn't really care about your race or where you come from, but the people receiving that care may feel that they need to be represented too, and that adds something. Is that factored in at all to your recruitment strategies? Is there anything that you're talking about at Macmillan in terms of sort of campaign stuff that you could do to encourage people from, say, Gen Z or an ethnical background or something like that?
Yeah, we are trying to better understand the underserved communities and how we can really add value by making sure that there's an opportunity for people to get involved rather than just be a recipient. So that there's a voice that people can use and feel more as though Macmillan is for everybody. And that's part of the things that we're doing as a whole organisation, to try to explore where we can really add that value. In London itself, we've got quite a few opportunities for the Afro-Caribbean community, such as a barber project and a hairdresser project, because we know people want to be in those places and have those conversations. But it comes back to trying to ensure that it isn't a top-down approach, that it is really having those conversations with what you as a particular community need from that organisation. That's aligned to the volunteer.
I think that's really important, that it's not a question of you identifying a gap and then trying to fill it. It's speaking to those particular communities and finding out what they need as well. And that's the smarter way to recruit in those groups. I mentioned the Gen Z angle because we've been talking a lot at Rostify about Gen Z volunteers. And, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but they are the future of your volunteer program. You have a certain demographic that will age out and they'll be replaced by the next generation that's coming in. They've got certain expectations, I suppose, about, not to overgeneralize them, but they're information on demand. They're very much a instant gratification kind of demographic. What have you done from like a modernization and digital aspect of volunteering at Macmillan to kind of account for their needs?
We've got lots of elements around thinking about how do we use social media and those kind of strategic ways of thinking about getting out to where people are. Some of our flexible volunteering opportunities are really designed at being something that you can be doing in your area, whether it's dropping off a postcard in your local neighbourhood, etc., so that you could just pick it up and do it and not feel that you're giving that broader commitment. Being there for people who are able to shape what they want to be doing in their future and really having that chance to listen to what it is that you want, really trying not to say, this is what we've always done, this is what we want to do, but what is it that you as a younger person might the way we want to get involved and how we can support that. So we are trying to make sure that we are listening to what people want to do, both individually, but also trying to understand the trends in the sector so that we can be thinking about, are the roles that we have now the right ones that are going to be needed in the future? People aren't giving time in the same way as they were before. We know that there's a lot more interest in things like social activism and how can we really tie on to that opportunity of being here. We have explored some kind of digital volunteering in the past and trying to have that kind of offer there. I don't think anything's off the table at the moment to be thinking about how can we really make sure that what we offer is something that you will want to take up.
I have a question actually that's from one of the trends that we like to do with this, the Engaged Volunteer podcast, is one of the last questions that we ask the guest is, what would you like to ask the next guest? And Oliver Chauvin, who's the head of the volunteer program at UEFA, who managed the Champions League football competition, they use Rostify to manage their volunteer program. And Oliver is a real character, bright guy. He did a great podcast with Shannon, one of our co-founders. And the question that he has asked, and don't worry, it's I'm sure you'll be fine with this, is how do you see the future of volunteer programs go in terms of like standardization? So he actually wrote a thesis on whether or not volunteer programs will be standardized. People expect certain things in them. What do you think of that from Oliver? And can you think of anything that you're sort of introducing in Macmillan to standardize the process of volunteering there?
Yeah, I think that my response to that would be around less about standardization in the sense of everybody looking exactly the same and doing exactly the same, and more around personalization. So the idea of a journey, and that journey which should be built to be as flexible as possible, would have those key elements of ensuring that we are talking to you in the right way and listening to you and providing the training and support that you're needed, giving you the opportunity to leave when you want to. There are key components of that volunteer management journey that I think would be standardised, but equally flexible enough that they don't have to be rigid. But the actual way of involving individuals in volunteering is less of a this is what everybody does and much more akin to some of the social movement area of being able to meet your needs. So that element is personalised.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I agree with you. I think personalisation is really important, but personalisation at scale is really challenging. So in a funny sort of way, I believe the answer to Oliver's question is there needs to be standardization, but we need to standardize a way of personalizing the volunteer experience. That will be a real challenge, but it's definitely something that technology can help fill the gap. And whether that's just through process management, through project management tools that ensure that you've, as a volunteer manager or an administrator, are doing certain checks. And then on the flip side of it, the user experience of, I don't know, interactive dashboards and profiles that I can see, oh, cool, I've given my details, I'm properly screened, I've completed the training, I have a checkpoint next to that, and, you know, and the communication I then get back from Macmillan is very specific to the roles that I'm involved in and what I'm doing. That feels like personalization, but it feels like personalization that's also automated into a process, making it scalable.
And in some ways, the automated elements free up that relationship building and that actual conversation that can happen between the volunteer manager and the volunteer.
Yeah, which is the heart of it all, really. Okay, thank you, Oliver. Moving on to the AVM. What is the AVM? And how did you get started in that?
So the Association of Volunteer Managers is a membership body for anybody who involves volunteers, whether they have volunteer manager in their job title, whether they directly manage volunteers, or whether they're strategic lead, or indeed whether they're volunteers themselves. They may well be volunteers. It's for everybody, whichever sector, whether it's the charitable sector or the corporate sector or the local authorities, etc. Anybody who wants to and involving to come along to learn, share good practice, explore, have deep conversations about what volunteer management is. We have been going for 17 years. It's nearly our 17th birthday on the 5th of June, and we are really exploring everything that we can be doing to make sure that people are equipped for their roles in that. I went along to the launch event nearly 17 years ago to be interested, because that whole idea of having a community of like-minded professionals was really interesting and valuable. And then probably about 7 years ago, I joined the board as a board member. It was an election, so I was proud enough to be elected to join the board.
Congratulations, 7 years ago.
And then within my time, I stood for chair in the election of the board, and I've been the chair for about 5 years, leading us into our teenage years, or through our teenage years, which is a lovely time to be exploring what we're doing. So,
How on earth do you balance a senior role at Macmillan with being the director? Or,
I've got white hair now.
Okay.
There's lots of relevant overlaps, and there's lots of ways that my role at Macmillan can feed information into my understanding of what volunteer managers need, so that some of the opportunities I have through being a chair can really add value to Macmillan.
So how do you make sure that your own bias doesn't take over there? Because you see what's needed at Macmillan, but you might not be what's necessarily needed another one. Yeah. Is that fair? Sorry, it's a bit cheeky question.
It's a very fair question. I am always interested and curious in what other people want and need, and that's why I'm in volunteer management, which does help me when I think about what else is going on out there. So my role at Macmillan is actually to be forward thinking about how we can take learnings from other organisations, and that gives me that headspace to not be too institutionalised, but to be able to understand what is there. And I think that's adding value. It's probably one of my positive personality traits as well, is to take those kind of different ideas and connections, think differently and pull things together. And that element of always being curious of what other people want and are thinking about means that I can listen to what other people are saying and doing in other organisations. Being on the board of an organisation like AVM and working in partnership with other organisations such as NAVCO and NCVO through the Vision for Volunteering, which is a project that we started a few years ago as a collection, means that I am always tapped into what other entities are saying and what other organisations.
So you're involved in those other associations as well? Yeah.
So the Vision for Volunteering is a programme that was started 2 or 3 years ago by a coalition of infrastructure bodies, including the Association of Volunteer Managers. So I can have those kind of conversations about what's happening in smaller organisations where there might not be any paid members of staff, but where they're going to be learning. So there's an opportunity to be able to think across. When I do go out and speak about my experience at Macmillan, it's quite right that some of the conversations and pushbacks that come from some of the other individuals who are listening to me would be, yes, but you're a big organisation, so how can you make what you're talking about replicable in a smaller one like myself, my own?
What do you say when they say that?
Well, actually, I think there's a lot that large organisations can learn from small organisations. And I think a lot of the skills that we're talking about when we're thinking about involving volunteers are probably really well executed at those smaller organisations that have the opportunity to build those relationships.
Grassroots relationships.
So I think there's a lot of learning from that. But I've also spoken about that a flexible infrastructure within a volunteer management journey. I think that that element around how you connect and communicate and collaborate with others is something that is replicable across the estate, whether or not you have the flashy amounts of money or whether or not you can build that. In some senses, it might be easier to be able to do it in a small organisation, and they're probably doing it right a lot of ways, even if they don't feel there's a trust mark that they can have. I think they should really own that.
Is there sometimes a danger of the AVM might have a focus on a particular challenge, say recruitment, for example, of volunteers, but that might not be felt by all their members, because there might be some charitable organisations where that really isn't a challenge for them. How do you kind of make sure that they feel value, but then you might be addressing certain topics that they might not have a challenge in? Is it about variety, or is it like...
Certainly about variety. There are anything that we are planning or doing or events that we're holding are informed by the event planning group, which is made of a mixture of different organisations. And we ask regularly after every event, is there anything you want to see more of, hear more of? And then we have an annual members survey that asks those exact questions. What do you want to see more of? And then we'll ask some deeper questions about what is it that's bothering you. So out of all of those, we can collate what it is that really people do want to hear about. We've also got a whole range of different ways of hearing from and communicating and talking. So as well as formal events, there are drop-in sessions, there's mentoring, there's just have a light touch conversation on this particular issue. So it's very much informed by the members. We're an organisation that's made by its members, for its members, of its members, and we really want to make sure that what we're talking about is of value. So there's a whole different range. We may very well talk about micro-volunteering and one opportunity, corporate volunteering, then get down to the nitty-gritty elements of recruitment, and then have some really deep philosophical conversations at almost the other end. So we are trying to make sure we've got the needs met by a variety of different offers that are out there.
Rostify sponsors and supports the AVM and several other charitable associations. I love working with these associations personally. I think, generally speaking, you guys are very hungry for content and connections and finding out stories within the industries as well. I only ever see boundless enthusiasm. I'm a massive advocate. But what would you say to charities that maybe aren't supporters yet of the AVM and similar, of like, here's a key benefit to getting involved. This is why you should make sure that your team connected to these groups. What do you think the main benefits are?
The key benefit is going to be learning from others and connecting from others and being able to add that diversity of thought to your own thoughts so that you don't become institutionalised in your own organisation's way of thinking. And if I can have two,
you can have whatever you want.
that ability to support each other. It can sometimes feel quite lonely when you've got a problem in front of you that you've never had before, and being able to learn from your colleagues who have done something similar in different organisations is really valuable. So come and join.
Come and join. Absolutely, come and join. Can we go a step back from AVM and then talk about the Samaritans? How did you first get started in what is a wonderful charity? It's no doubt you were there some time as well, isn't it?
7 years.
7 years again. Yeah, okay. And yeah, I think they're absolutely brilliant. That must have been incredibly rewarding to work for them. But then also, I'd love to know how you managed to move away as well, because the hook there would be quite significant for you to stay. As I said at the start when we were talking, I think one common theme I find with people in senior positions in charities is the guilt of leaving too, and you put your heart into it. So could you tell me a little bit about the Samaritans, your role, and that journey that you took on there?
So I've always been a passionate supporter of Samaritans. I always will be. I had difficulties in my teenage years that meant that I had called the Samaritans. I've never said that publicly, so there you go, there's a scoop. So there was something that I was really interested in. I was already...
Thank you for sharing that, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. I was already working within the volunteer management field, and when a role came up, there was the natural next step on my career progression. So I was a coordinator. This was an officer level role at Samaritans. It felt that was the right time to really make a commitment to something that I had been benefited by, and I could really think that that's something I could put my weight behind. So I was really desperate to get the role. I was so pleased that I did get the role, and it was an officer role, so I really learned my as I grew up as a volunteer manager within that organisation, which is so much based on volunteering. Some of the things that I really learned, I'm so pleased I was able to, because I think it's not an experience that every volunteer manager has, is the genuine opportunity to be led by volunteers. So you certainly can't do a top-down, or you couldn't when I was there, but I assume not. You couldn't do a top-down policy change on how we're going to involve and recruit volunteers. You had to do everything, and it's the way I prefer to work, so this is positive, with volunteers. So everything I was doing there would bring together a working group of volunteers, and sometimes deliberately bringing in views that would be different from my own, because that really added
So
that.
back then, really, you're forging this behaviour that you've hinted at throughout most of your career of pulling in ideas and inspiration from places that are slightly out left field of where you're thinking.
Yes, because I think that's what's going to make it different, complete, accurate, but also it's really based in what people want to say rather than what's in my head or in a central organisation's head. It's really got value to where people want to be. During my career time at Samaritans, I also became a Samaritans volunteer, so that was a fascinating...
Is that on the phone, speaking to people? Yeah, okay.
I was able to then see both perspectives of the volunteer management journey that I am developing and leading and supporting. And
so you initially came in sort of like a back office position and then moved on to the front line speaking to people as well.
I did both. So the frontline roles are volunteering roles, almost a back office. It's the job element. Back in the day, we used to refer to it as being the staff of the civil service to the ministers that were out there actually doing the work. And that was a lot of the culture, I think, from that perspective. So that was really helpful for me to experience what it was like to be a volunteer. Thus, all the elements that were being created back end by me in my job role. I could see that.
Yeah, so you could see, you could almost see the outcome of your own work in the role that you'd taken on.
Yes, but also I could see where things weren't working. On the ground, and where we could make things easier or more seamless and bring people in differently and have those kind of conversations.
What did you take from that, the ministers, the frontline role? I mean, what an amazing, selfless, and I can't think of a more empathetic use of your time than speaking to somebody when they are at the lowest point for them. Tell me a little bit about what that is like as a volunteer. What was that like being on the front for that?
The word is probably overused, but it does feel like a privilege to give your time to somebody who is talking about how angry or frightened or worried or all those things. I think you come away feeling that was a valuable use of my time to be there, and I'm so glad I was able to be there.
Yeah. Do you find if you're doing that you're almost osmosis absorbing some of the challenges, or do you feel like you actually help them mentally push through that wall a little bit? Is it a case of I'm taking it, like if somebody tells you a secret or somebody tells you a problem that they're having, they say a problem shared is a problem halved, right? If you're doing that role, do you feel like you're taking on a little bit of their challenge, or do you see yourself more as kind of like I'm helping you get through that thing? Do you get what I'm asking?
What you mean. And one of the things that Samaritans always had was a leader system whereby you never left the branch carrying all the weight.
So this is where I'm going with that question, because I was going to ask from an operational point of view, how do they make sure that at the end of the day you're not just like filled up your backpack full of problems and then you're going to walk home thinking about other people's challenges, because that's quite a lot to deal with.
There's certainly an awareness that it's easy to be filled up, to hear people's stories and to carry it all with you. And sometimes there are calls that I had that resonated with those kind of calls that I made in my adolescence, and those were the ones it's hard to let.
Can't shake that stuff off, can you? Because it feels.
You make sure that you've got that. You do debrief. You do talk to somebody in the branch.
But I think, ironically, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but when you were speaking to somebody that was in a similar position to yourself, you probably don't even realise how much that meant to that individual, because your empathy couldn't help but come through them, because you'd be like, I know where you're coming from. It's an incredibly selfless and wonderful thing for you to do, to offer that time to do that. And it's just one of the many examples, I think, where volunteers genuinely change people's lives, which is really inspirational. Yeah, really good. If you could think of a question that you would like to ask the next guest, I'd be more than happy to pass that on.
It's one of the things that I'm gathered that I'm passionate about, connecting ideas and people and thoughts. So one of the things that I've tried to do through Association of Volunteer Managers is to align practitioners, so those people who manage volunteers, with some of the theory and research that is happening about volunteering, and how do we bridge that divide, because it doesn't seem as though we as practitioners are hearing a lot from what's happening research-wise, and that researchers don't necessarily come directly to us. So there's an element there.
There's a disconnect between the two.
It feels like there is, and I think it's certainly something I've been trying to do. And I'm going to plug my book again. My book is co-written with an academic, Jürgen Ross, around theory and practice of volunteer involvement. It's not.
Is that the title? What's the title of the book?
It's Theory and Practice of Volunteer Involvement. I can show it to you now. The reason I wanted to flag it is because there are lots of research papers that I've been really interested in, and lots of academic thoughts, and one of the key ones for me is A Rose by Any Name, which was written by Angela Ellis Payne and others. So I suppose a question is, what piece of research or thinking from outside the field has influenced your next guest?
Okay, we'll definitely ask that question. Do you find inspiration from other fields completely different from volunteering? Where do you go to get those sort of left field examples of maybe where things could be better managed? Or I suppose in the charity sector you could also look at like the private sector and corporates that have a good way of working and see if there's trends that dovetail into an organisation. But
you also mentioned silos that there are within charities such as fundraising and volunteering, and how can both learn from each other, what policy debates that are happening, and how can we learn from that, particularly within a health charity, but probably all others, is how are we hearing the voices of lived experience, and how are we learning from participation and community development? That's probably my area of real interest.
Where are you going to get that information? Where are you finding inspiration there?
So being part of conferences and listening to what people are talking about, and signing up to various media to go, okay, that's what they're saying in the participation field, and trying to build those links between organisations that are doing different things. So there are organisations that lead on public participation, for example, and trying to have opportunities to share the two and just think about where is it we can actively take some learning from. You mentioned AVM events and conferences. We do try to make sure we bring in people from outside volunteer management, whether that's people from a different part of the structure of an organisation, or whether it is somebody completely outside. We try to make sure that we've got that voice being expressed. And obviously there's volunteers themselves, most of whom have got really big jobs in big parts of resident society. So listening to exactly what they think we could be doing and bringing their learning in.
The team at Rostify tends to volunteer a lot themselves as well. And as a London team, I think we're quite good at it. We volunteered not so long ago with the London Youth Games, and they had an indoor rowing event, which was in the Copper Box, I think. Do you know that?
They play netball, I think.
That's it, yeah. So one of the venues that was for the London Olympics, for those that don't know, they invested a lot of money into the Olympic grounds. And one of the best things that they've done from that is they've reused a lot of the stadiums and the arenas. And an organisation called London Youth Games, who try to encourage young people to be involved in sports, particularly sports, I suppose, that would maybe not be normally accessible to them. Rowing isn't necessarily what you'd think of for, like, inner city urban kids. One of the volunteers that I met there, just to address what you were just saying there about like the volunteers background as well. How about this as a bit of a volunteer background? I was sitting with a chap during the debrief, just after the debrief, and I said to him, I introduced myself. I said, hi, I'm Martin, and he told me his name, and I said, oh, well, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm head of counter-terrorism for the London Underground. And I was like, oh, I could just sit with you all day. Like, I want to know what your job is about. And since then, I've always asked people that are around me, like, not just like, why are you volunteering, or like, what's your motivation here? I love finding out what they do when they're not volunteering, because there's such a broad mix of people. And I think for a lot of charities, it sounds like you're already on this, but I think a lot of charities could learn so much just from finding out what their volunteers do when they're not volunteering, and see if there are skills where you're offering your time to help with the cause, but there could be a completely different left field way of you helping us actually, and it could be operationally, it could be a different introducing some of the skills that you take for granted because you work all day. I'm not saying that there's much of a crossover between counterterrorism and and that, but problem solving, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that comes back to the importance of building that relationship with somebody. So you're not just Martin who's going to do this role. You are Martin with this wealth of experience and connections and all of the other things that could really add value. Could tear my role apart because you can see a different way of doing it, and that's why that building that relationship and making those connections is so important.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's good. What do you do when you're not juggling two key senior jobs for one of the UK's most recognised charities and a fantastic association that supports volunteers?
I'm a city girl, I'm a Londoner born and bred, so with that in mind, I do love to escape and go out to the countryside and be in the middle of nowhere. But the other thing of why I will never leave the city, sorry to my partner who keeps trying to get me to leave cities. I love stories, so I love going to the theatre and hearing music and art galleries and all those kind of connections. So both of those two extremes are what will make me relax.
Yeah. Would you find it a bit unnerving if you moved out into the middle of nowhere?
Permanently, yes.
Yeah, I find now that I've lived in London for quite some time, silence is deafening. If I ever take a trip out and I'm staying like in a hotel in the middle of nowhere or something, I find that...
So you wake up because of the silence.
That's it. I miss the sirens and the flashing blue lights and the foxes knocking over the rubbish bins. I don't know if I could deal with that. I'd have to bring a soundtrack of that news out to wherever I've gone, I think. Cool. Okay. Well, that's all the questions that I had to ask. I want to say thank you for coming over to come and see us, even though it wasn't that far and you're a Londoner and running around the corner. We do really appreciate you coming to say hello and recording this with us. Thanks so much for listening to the Engaged Volunteer podcast. Check out more of our content on our website, rostify.com.